privilege this morning to introduce to you Dr. Douglas Laird. Royce has already told you when he was pastor here, and many of you already know what he did while he was here. Dr. Laird helped this church and really motivated this church to pay off the debt that it still owed on this sanctuary even when he came. And he visited every single home in this church and brought together the needed commitments to pay off the debt, and really is considered one of the great heroes of Grace Temple Baptist Church. And we are privileged this morning to have him. After he left Grace Temple, he went to Dallas Baptist University as Vice President of Development, and then spent many years in church fundraising, helping churches all across this nation raise $180 million, and he did that in 152 churches. His wife, Prue, is here with him this morning, and Joanna and I were privileged 2 years ago as we were heading to another part of the country to stop by and to spend a night at their home and just to spend some time with them, to fellowship with them and to get to know them. And we are so glad this morning to have Dr. Douglas Laird as our preacher.
About all you can do after that is cry. I know the hour is late, and there are so many things that I should say and would like to say, but I trust that you will understand if I do not single out all of the individuals to whom I owe a debt of gratitude. I just appreciate so much what you have done, and let me, with no undue optimism, say that I think your future is ahead of you. I say that very sincerely. I think Grace Temple has one of the greatest futures, and is on the most steady ground it's been on probably in a long, long time. I appreciate so much your pastor. And it's evident that God has led you and him to perform this ministry together. I appreciate my preacher brethren who are here. And when my message unfolds this morning, you're going to realize that Brother Eddie and I came loaded with the same gun. We came with the same text. We came with the same message. But instead of my backing off and going another direction, I'm simply going to compliment what he has said. And I believe that that only emphasizes what God has in mind for this church in the first place. Several months ago, reading devotionally in 1 Corinthians, I came to the passage that is most familiar to perhaps everyone here. Now you're trying to remember what Brother Eddie used. Do you remember the three words he mentioned? He mentioned faith, mentioned hope, he mentioned love. As I was reading that day, I came on 1 Corinthians 13:13, which reads, "Now remaineth faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love." I stopped rather abruptly in my reading because I thought, wait a minute. This is what I've heard Paul say elsewhere. I had been reading devotionally, just circling through again and again through the writings of Paul. I thought, he has these same words grouped together elsewhere. And I began to look for them. And I found that those three words, faith, hope, love, appear in that same order in Colossians, in 1 Thessalonians twice, and other verses of the New Testament contain those words. So I hope it's not too much of a repetition this morning when I share something that is weighty on my heart, and perhaps words that you can take with you as you pursue the ministry of God. There are three of these words, and I want to just simply title the sermon, "3 Words to Live By." I kind of wanted to title the message "From the Cross to the Crown," because that's the span of time that we have an obligation in our living for God. We start it at the point of conversion. We end it at the point of our decease. And I kind of wanted to take that and deal with it this morning, but that would be too involved. So let me just briefly this morning, and if I seem to be entirely too brief, just remember, you can't just go too far on an empty stomach, and when people are sitting there listening, hungry, they're not going to pay attention to what you have to say anyhow. So let me briefly review these 3 words, 3 words to live by. The first is faith. I suppose that of all the words in the New Testament to which the believer will aspire, none would exceed the word faith. You remember that that's the one word that the disciples asked for. Luke 17, verse 5. Lord, increase our faith. Now, having asked such a noble question and made such a noble request, you would think that Jesus would have said, all right, I'll do that. Since you have not asked for wealth, since you have not asked for prestige, since you have not asked for vengeance upon your enemies, but you have asked for faith, and I'm going to grant a double portion of faith. But did he? No. Why didn't he? Because faith cannot grow by itself. And one thing that each of us aspires to in faith is that our faith would be increased. And faith is increased only as it's exercised. Faith is increased only as it's exercised. And Jesus could just as easily have said, if you have faith as a grain of sand, and thereby dwell on the fact of the minuteness of it. But the reason that he said a mustard seed instead of a grain of sand is because the grain of sand has no potential for growth. None whatsoever. Pile up 1,000,000 grains of sand and not one of them will sprout. But he took a seed that will sprout, a seed that will grow, a seed that will become even a tree, the size of a tree. And that's what Jesus used, because Jesus knew that if their faith would ever grow, it must be exercised. How many times have we as believers spoken of our faith only to be so doubting when the problem comes? Have we really exercised faith? I think of so many things at this point. But so many times we have the opportunity to grow our faith and we stand still. We stop. We do nothing. How many times have you faced a problem and you throw up your hands and you quit? That may be the one problem that will fertilize the seed of faith and cause it to grow and expand. But faith grows only as it's exercised. And I might add this, if it is exercised regularly, it will grow to be the size of a tree. So faith must be exercised if it's going to grow. Let's just move on to number 2 and deal with hope. Faith, hope. Perhaps someone will say, well, that really is an important word. What significance does that have for the Christian walk? Well, maybe it could be emphasized in this way. Let's imagine that you are in the hospital waiting room and a loved one, a wife, a husband, a son or daughter, father or mother, someone is in the surgery room. And the doctor is performing a very delicate, a very difficult, and questionable surgery. You pace the floor, waiting and wondering how much longer will it be. And when the doctor comes to the door and motions to you, you hasten, hoping to hear the words, they're going to be all right. But instead you hear the words, there's no hope. Perhaps that would emphasize how really big hope is in our life. Jesus wants us to use hope. He expected us to believe him when he said there's going to be a resurrection. And I anticipate the resurrection. I have a hope of the resurrection because Jesus said it. And what a refreshment it is to me, because Paul said, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. Not only the resurrection. We have a funeral director this morning, and how many times has he heard from this pulpit and other pulpits in the community about the hope of the believer in the resurrection? What if a pastor had to stand in this pulpit and conduct a funeral service and simply tell the folks, there's no hope? Hopeless. I'm glad that we have a hope of the resurrection. I'm glad we have a hope of the home in heaven. I'm glad that Jesus promised to build a place. I like that word, place. I think it has some significance. He has built a place for us, and he awaits to welcome us to our home. And as you would expect in a gathering like this, we've all taken on some weight, gray hair. I really wouldn't mind my hair turning gray if it didn't turn loose. But we've seen the evidence of aging, and some have already left and gone on to be with the Lord. And the day's coming, and this is my hope, that I too shall join and be with him on the other side. Now, living by faith, living by hope, living by love. Now, I said 3 words. Why didn't I say 2? Why didn't I say 4? Because there simply is not another one that stands with those 3. Study them. No other word falls in the same category as those 3 as it relates to this life. I had not noticed that, but that's what Paul is saying. And he said, the greatest of these is love. Greater than my hope? Yes. Greater than your securities? Yes. The one thing that we seem to have so little of is love for one another. I don't mean necessarily passions of the flesh. Don't mean that at all. But the love that Paul speaks of, the spirit of man, and how that love is identified in man's heart. I think Christian love can solve a lot of things that we cannot solve otherwise. I don't think of a better problem solver to take to the peace tables than love. I don't know of anything that will bring nations together more than Christian love. And we can talk about solutions all we want to. But there's not going to come a solution to our national problems until there comes a revival to America. The heart of man has to be changed. There has to be that love for one another. Love in the schoolroom. Love in the courthouse. Love in the family home. As a matter of fact, Paul says that we are empty without it. He says, if I should speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I have become a sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. Have you ever noticed the contrast of the sounding brass and the tinkling cymbal? On one side, he speaks of this huge brass gong that when hit by the mallet, it sound echoes across the hills and through the valleys till finally it's exhausted in the atmosphere. But then he says, or a tinkling cymbal, the little bitty bell. That's all there's to it. He said, if I'm this or that, if I don't have love, I'm nothing. Though I speak with the tongues of men, can you imagine a person who can speak every tongue in the nations of the earth? I hear people complimented from time to time that can speak 2, 3, maybe 4 languages. Oh, how great they are. Oh, but Paul is saying, if I were to be able to speak every language there is, if I don't have love, it's nothing. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels. Paul, could you speak with the angel on the announcement of the birth of Christ? Oh, yes, yes. I can speak all the angelic language. But then he says, even though I do that, I am nothing, nil, without love. Empty. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge. Paul, you mean to tell me that you understand all the mysteries of the universe? All the mysteries of science? All the mysteries of archaeology? All the mysteries of astrology, astronomy? Get that word right. Paul, you mean you could know all of that and still? Yeah, that's right. If I had all of that, absolutely super person, and have not love, I'm blank. Nothing. And he goes on in that chapter to tell about what love is and what love is not. As a matter of fact, I believe there are about 15 positive and negatives about it. Now, let's look at these 3 words, having touched on them very briefly. If you would walk with Christ, You need to walk with faith, believing what the eyes cannot see. We walk by faith, not by sight, Paul said. If you walk by faith, if you walk in hope, if you walked in love. But Doug, how can we do it? How can we do it? I want to tell you a story. Several years ago, Dad had surgery. And at that time, it was a pretty serious operation. So much so that the family was all asked to be there. And I remember we waited while Dad went through the surgery. And he came out, went to his room, and was there for a while. And having gone over from here to there, I knew I'd have to be returning here. And I asked the family just please to go on back home, and I would stay there with Dad, and they could come later. So I was sitting in the room with my dad. He was sound asleep. And I was reading, and I had, on my way to be with my dad, I had simply picked up a book at home and put it in my briefcase. And it turned out that the name of the book was The Eschatology of Paul. I don't know whether you've ever heard of the book or not, it doesn't matter. But that was the title of the book, The Eschatology of Paul. And I was reading it while Dad was sleeping. And I read a verse of Scripture that kind of struck me strange. And I read it again and went on my way. I wanted to get up and stretch my legs, so I walked down the hall to the reception area, the Old Baptist Hospital in Jackson. And standing in the reception area, I noticed on the wall there were pictures of two people, a man and obviously his wife, an older couple, gray-haired. I presume that they were benefactors of the hospital and had been honored by their portraits being on the wall. But then I saw something. I thought they favor each other. And I remember I had heard that over and over again. People can live together long enough until they look like each other. Now, that's a compliment to the men, but the women are horrified by that. But I thought, hey, that's it. They favor each other. They've lived together. They've admired each other until they favor each other. I went back down the hall rather quickly and picked up the book and reread that verse. And it turned out to be 1 Corinthians 3:18. And it's the translation that I had, and I didn't know at the time, but it turned out it was the Revised Standard Version. I want you to hear the way it reads. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another. Did you hear that? Remember about favoring each other? Paul said, and we all with unveiled face. The unveiled face, as you remember or will know if you read in that passage, means the removing of the blindness that the Jews had in Jesus. If you witness to a Jew, that just as if a veil was pulled over their face, they couldn't understand what you're talking about because they didn't accept Christ. But Paul said, all of us are saved, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding, not beheld, beholding, continuing action, beholding the glory of the Lord. What? Not ourselves, not our neighbors. Beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another. If the temperature outside were to drop from 100 to 75 in 3 hours, that's rather rapid movement. But it had to drop 1 degree at a time. So many times, believers, and hear me now, Christians, so many times believers have the feeling, I want to be like so-and-so who's such a super Christian. So I want to become a super Christian. And they expect to become a super Christian in a day or two. It doesn't work that way. When you become a Christian, you have a lot of growing to do. Listen to that verse again. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, looking at him, fasting your eyes on him, in all of these ways, in prayer and meditation, all those. Beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed, not instantaneously, are being changed into his likeness from 1 degree to another, one at a time. Tell you one more brief story and I'll conclude. Several years ago, I was in the DFW airport and I was making a telephone call. That was before the mass development of telephones that we have in our pockets now. And if you called anyone, you had to go get one of the telephones or use one of the telephones on the wall in the airport. And there was just a bank of them. And I was standing there at one of them, and I had turned my back to the person next to me. And the wall was this way, and I was standing here like this, talking to my party, and watching the avalanche of people as they moved down the corridor. And as I watched them, I noticed this old couple. And I thought, they favor each other. Are you surprised when I tell you, when I dropped my eyes, I saw they were holding hands. They were holding hands. Faith, hope, love. How are you going to possibly exercise them? By keeping your eyes on Jesus. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from 1 degree of glory to another. That's the way we grow in faith, in hope, in love. Brother Pastor.
Dr. Laird, thank you.